I was here to talk to you.
Do I need to like stay or break it? Okay. Um, my name is Matt Schneirov from Sociology Department, and I'll get things started. Let me introduce our panelists. Um, we have Deidra, who probably everybody knows, but I'll give you a little introduction. She's president of the Sociology Club, president of Student Veteran Association, organizing member of the Elsinore-Bennu think tank for restorative justice. In our joint MA/BA program in applied public sociology, you'll hear more about that from Dr. Irwin pretty soon. And she is a major course in sociology, minor in political science. And we have Rachel Maines, that she is right there. Rachel is Executive Vice President of Residence Hall Association and Resident Assistant in Political Science and Sociology double major with a pre-law certificate. Rachel's also in my class. She's a great student, so it's good to see you here. We have Ethan Horan, who will be here soon, President of Student Health and Wellbeing Club, psychology major, biology and sociology minor. And of course, last but not least, we have Dr. Michael Irwin, who is director of our MA program in applied and public sociology. This is our first year. Certainly encourage anybody out there in the Zoom world or here, if you're interested in the program, talk to Dr. Irwin. So why don't we get started? There are a number of questions in preparing for this panel that Dee provided, and I'm gonna, if I was actually gonna go over every single one, we might be here for a couple of hours, but I'm gonna focus on a few of them, which I think is fine with you. So I want to talk a little bit about what social movements are, and also how do we determine whether one is successful, and what is the larger political, economic environment today within which social movements can be understood. And finally, and maybe I probably won't devote a lot of time to this, any advice I would give to people interested in becoming active. So let's get started here. So today, I think we're in a somewhat unusual situation, not only in the United States, but globally, where we see a global wave on the left and the right. I think living in the United States, we're well aware of that, or at least we should be. On the left, we have anti-austerity movements that protest against free market economic policies that have dominated the global economy, policies that have resulted in lower wages, cuts in social welfare states, privatization of public institutions like schools, for example, and prisons. Also, new movements for racial justice, comparatively new, like Black Lives Matter, as well as movements for sexual justice in the LGBTQ plus community. A third wave of feminist activism, movements on college campuses against sexual violence, movements for swifter action on climate change, for example, what's happening in Glasgow, Scotland, at the UN Climate Change Conference. Activism that seeks to address the crisis in affordable housing, unionized workers in major industries like Amazon, and Walmart, movements for a living wage. And this is kind of touching on a number of them. And most of these today are global, not just in the United States. Now, on the right, and you could make an argument that the global wave of right-wing activism is larger and more profound today than on the left, but that may be another issue to think about and talk about. So on the right, there's a global movement that seeks to restrict immigration and entry of refugees, that sees itself as fighting for a certain version of nationalism, sometimes called racial ethnic nationalism. It wants to purify the nation, either in terms of religion, as in India, with a Hindu nationalist government, or race, as in the United States, or ethnicity, as in many places in Europe. Movements on the right that oppose the whole idea of a multiracial democracy, either not always openly, but certainly implicitly. Movements that, okay, sure. Yeah. That's okay. That's okay. Movements that focus on symbolic issues, somewhat symbolic, such as the attack against supposedly the teaching of critical race theory in schools, which is in large part about a kind of a reaction to not only trends in the academic world, but in the larger world, racial justice, among other things. In addition, on the right in the United States, perhaps other countries as well, opposition to meaningful reform in the criminal justice system. So, and all of this is extremely important, unfortunately, from I think our point of view, as the movements on the left today. So, what do all these things have in common? What is a social movement? What do all these things on the right and the left have in common? Well, folks that study social movements are more or less in agreement. They don't agree on very much, but there's certainly an agreement about what social movements are. And first of all, groups, networks, organizations that seek to advance some change, seek to change something in society, or, and this is sometimes called counter movements, movements that seek to undo a change already made, so that the resurgence of the right began as a series of counter movements against the movements in the 1960s, such as civil rights, Black liberation, second wave feminism. So number two, a movement consists of activists and others who share common purposes and solidarities. People who participate either as activists or on the sidelines know roughly what they're participating in, so that may seem obvious, but you can't be in a movement if you don't know what it's doing, and if you're not active in some way, even observing. The movement, at least in part, uses unconventional tactics to achieve their goals. Today, that's less true than it was, but what I mean by that is movements do things like break laws, either through civil disobedience or sometimes just breaking laws in order to make a point. Confront authorities, work at least at times outside the system, in part because access to the system is often denied to them, which is why folks need movements rather than working within institutional politics. Although typically movements do both. They work within institutional politics and outside too. So that this distinction is a little blurry. So a movement is not in and of itself an advocacy group, an interest group, concerned citizens writing letters that may be part of the movement, but in and of itself it really isn't. A movement needs to be confronting authorities over some period of time, which leads us to the fourth element of social movements. Movements engage with authorities in various ways. You could say elites or people in positions of power. in a sustained way in terms of time and space over some period of time. So in other words, it's not just a one-shot deal. There are protest, in a sense, is a broader term than social movement. You can have a protest, but if it doesn't last beyond that one incident, it's hard to call it a movement. All right, so what makes a movement successful? This is a very interesting question that Dee asked, and people do discuss this and debate it. There are books written about that very topic. I'll give you my kind of slant on that. The first thing we need to do is define what does it mean to be successful in a movement. The model is often the civil rights movement, but there are other models of success. So there's general agreement that we have to look at three things in judging whether a movement is successful. Whether a movement is successful in changing institutions. A lot of this is a matter of what does the movement desire to do. Not all movements want to change institutions, but that can be one standard. The second is, does the movement change the culture, even if it doesn't change institutions? So it's possible for a movement to want to enact new legislation, new reforms, fail to do that, but change the culture in a way that may advance other changes later. And we might want to call that successful. And the third is that movements that don't necessarily work on the first two levels almost always change people that participate. One of the findings of all social movement research in the last 30, 40 years is that movements are mobilizing structures, are places where people learn to be activists, and then later they continue their activism in other movements. So even if the movement fails, you have a bunch of people that enjoy activism, find it meaningful, find the connections with other people meaningful, and want to continue in other ways later. Lots of examples of that. Folks that were involved in Occupy, in positions of leadership, all of them were involved in movements such as Global Social Justice, ACT UP, Clamshell Alliance. But these were all training grounds for future movements. Some of them were also successful in other ways too. So a related question then is not only how are movements successful, or what does success mean, but what does it take for a movement to achieve success on any of these levels? The model of maybe a fully successful movement on all three levels would be perhaps the civil rights movement. Civil rights movement certainly achieved its goals and changed institutions and created new institutions. Certainly changed the individuals who were active in it, as well as allies, white allies, who supported it. And certainly changed the culture. We could argue it didn't do enough, didn't go far enough, but in terms of the actual goals of the civil rights movement, we might think of that as a model of success. So what does that tell us about what it takes to be successful for a movement? It seems to me that movements, to be successful, have to operate on a variety of levels. So I mentioned before that movements use unconventional tactics, but typically success requires both unconventional and conventional tactics working outside and inside institutions. So that's kind of my point of view about that. There are actually a lot of disagreements about that very point. I think if we look at the civil rights movement as a model, developing leadership is another important requirement for movements. And today, social movements want to develop leaders in a more democratic and participatory way that was often done in the 1960s. To some extent, even the concept of leadership is being challenged. But nevertheless, there are activists play a leadership role. The idea is to expand opportunities for leadership to more and more people, especially across racial and gender lines. Those are at least a couple of ideas. And maybe the last one is that successful movements have to be strategic and take advantage of opportunities, especially divisions among folks that disagree with them, especially at the level of the state, elites, and look for powerful allies and be helpful. Certainly the civil rights movement did that in a very sophisticated way. Just wanted to come up a couple of other examples. I don't want to run out of time here. I may run out of time in terms of these questions here. If we look at the Occupy movement in terms of the question about what makes a movement successful, it expanded rapidly. There were hundreds of cities all over the world that had occupations. But then it got crushed very quickly. Unlike the Tea Party on the right, there didn't seem to be any efforts to sustain an Occupy organization because it was anti-organization, which is very common on the left. It did not want to work within the electoral system. So some people think that, well, they could have done things differently. It wasn't successful. On the other hand, if you look at American politics since the Occupy movement, 2011, I think, Democratic parties moved considerably to the left of the political spectrum. The demands of the Occupy movement are now mainstream in the Democratic Party. Bernie Sanders, significant advisor, head of the Budget Committee in the Senate. Biden's Build Back Better program would have been considered absurdly radical under the Obama administration and reflects a lot of the principles of the Occupy movement. So in that sense, we can call the Occupy movement a success. So this is kind of a fuzzy, interesting, and difficult question. So what are we seeing today in the world of social movement? Well, I kind of touched on that in the beginning, but we're seeing movements against neoliberalism on the left, that is these free market economic policies. And that's reflected in third parties and in political candidates such as Bernie Sanders in the United States, certainly all throughout Europe. But we're also seeing nationalist movements on the right and an upsurge in racism connected to nationalism, not only throughout Europe, but also throughout Latin America and Asia, from Brazil to India to Hungary and Poland. We have authoritarian regimes. We see an upsurge of right-wing movements throughout Western Europe and Northern Europe, in places like the Netherlands. Associate that with an upsurge of the far right, as well as Brexit, leaving the European Union in the UK. So that's significant. And at the same time, identity movements have become more powerful than ever, that challenge forms of racial, gender, sexual oppression, that fight against the silencing and devaluing of identities. And that's going on at the same time. Sorry, what advice do I have for folks? So I'll answer that simply. If any of you are interested in becoming active, then you don't need advice from me, because you already have crossed the threshold. You know, if you think something's wrong with this world, and God knows, it seems obvious, and you have looked into it, and you've decided to take the risk, and there's always some risk, in getting active, then you should give me advice at this point. I mean, I would recommend that you look into the issue you're interested in, that you get to know activists and learn from them. That's probably the best place to start. I think the main point, and the way I want to end here, is that Frederick Douglass said that famous quote. I don't have the actual quote. To paraphrase him, there is no progress without struggle. Progress is not automatic. And even when it is made with struggle and pain, you can expect a ferocious and often violent counterattack. Not only expected, it's almost an iron law that it will happen. And there'll be, for every 2 or 3 steps forward, there'll be a step or two, hopefully only a step or two backward. And we're in the middle of that now. So this calls upon all of us to take risks, to preserve gains that have been made, and move the ball forward at least a little bit. So thank you, Dee, for getting this together. And we have our next panelist is all right. It's Dee. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Just give me 1 moment. Let's go.
Oh, thank you.
So good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate you all being here. Thank you, Dr. Schneirov, for introducing this panel. Dr. Schneirov started us off with some context about social movements, and for the student presenters today, we're going to do a little bit more of a story mapping, story narrative about our social justice journeys. My name is Deidra Hubay. Ever since I was a little girl, I have been outspoken and headstrong. But what I didn't know was that spark inside of me was a passion for justice, fairness, equity, and respect, waiting to be ignited. To this day, my mom still says one of her proudest mom moments was my first elementary school Halloween party when I was in kindergarten. We get there, and I'm holding my mom's hand while she talked with some of the other parents. I see some 3rd grade boys bullying a girl about her weight and body shaming her in her costume. So here I am, 5 years old, clutched to my mom's arm, when suddenly I rip my hand from her grip. As she tells it, I march over there, plant myself right between them, cross my arms, and yell, "Hey, leave her alone. What's wrong with you? She's the prettiest kitty I ever did see." And I gave her the biggest hug. A few years later, I moved from New Jersey to Pittsburgh with my mom. When I was in 5th grade, our school segregated the playground by gender, girls on one side and boys on the other. The worst part was that the boys' half had a basketball hoop and a 4-square board, and the girls' side had nothing. 5th grade me would absolutely not stand for this. My dad always told me to speak my mind, but to do it respectfully. So respectfully, I organized a petition, gathered signatures from students, parents, and even teachers, and I went home and told my parents of my plan to deliver it to our principal, Dr. Washington, and asked them to sign it. Not only did both my parents sign it, but this became my mom's next proudest mom moment. At 15, I came home, sat my parents down, and told them I was joining the military. Not that I wanted to join the military, but that I was joining the military. If I want to help people, I can't just talk about it. I need to be about it. I can't just walk the walk or talk the talk. I need to walk the walk too. I've been lucky enough to have a good life with good parents who love me and raised me to be strong and independent. So it's settled. I'm doing it. They just kind of looked at me for a minute and said, "Okay, and why the Marine Corps? What about, like the Air Force or the Navy or something?" And I said, "No, girls can do anything. Go big or go home. Besides, joining the Marine Corps was the last thing society would have expected out of me, and somehow that made it all the more enticing." Others told my parents not to worry, that this was just a phase that I would outgrow. "You don't know my daughter," they said. Sure enough, for the next few years, I participated in physical training, or PT as we would call it, at the local recruiting station where I was now living in Philadelphia. At 17, I formally enlisted in the delayed entry program and left for boot camp shortly after graduating high school. In November 2015, I graduated from boot camp and became a United States Marine. After completing Marine combat training and my job training, or MCT in the schoolhouse, as we would say, I was sent to the fleet and stationed on Camp Pendleton in Southern California. Being a woman in the Marine Corps, I quickly realized my role as a super minority. Women make up just 8% of the entire Marine Corps. 7.5% of those women are officers. meaning I was part of the less than 0.5% of women who were enlisted active duty female Marines, making these the lowest ratio of women in all U.S. branches. For women of color, these numbers are even lower. Needless to say, military culture is not very inclusive of women, and the stereotyping runs rampant. We had a saying, perception is reality. So I worked hard not to be one of those women. You know the kind of woman I mean, right? The kind of woman that my male peers would look down on, or the kind of woman who didn't earn her promotions, but apparently was given them as payment for sexual favors. The kind of woman who made excuses to get out of training. The kind of woman that was just part of another stereotype. That wasn't going to be me. Marine Corps emphasized, well, the Marine Corps emphasized well-roundedness and encouraged its members not only to be physically fit, but to be mentally fit. So in a continuous effort to prove myself, I took college classes in the evenings after my work day. At work, I carried my own weight, kept up during PT, did pull-ups, had a perfect score on my combat fitness test, shot expert on the range. I did all the things that I was supposed to. I won awards and medals for my superior performance of duty and my subject matter expertise. And as my hard work was paying off and being noticed, a week after my 19th birthday, I was promoted to corporal and became a non-commissioned officer. Fast forward a little bit, and I got hurt one day while I was PTing. I needed surgery on my left foot and months of subsequent recovery time and physical therapy. Suddenly, who I was to them before didn't matter. I was one of those women. Weak, useless. It wasn't the fact that all the PT gear and packs were made for men and caused excess stress to the female body. It wasn't the fact that people who got hurt didn't have the proper support or resources to heal. It wasn't the fact that the stigma of going to the doctor and being one of those women was so severe that I didn't go to the doctor until it got really bad. Maybe I really was one of those women. What was I ever even doing thinking otherwise? At this point, not only was I trying to physically heal, but my mental and emotional health needed a lot of healing too. I did think about going to therapy, and inside I knew that it was what I needed to do. But I also knew that going to therapy would only further confirm that I really was one of those women. A few months later, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I witnessed my friend and fellow Marine attempt to take their own life. That very next morning, I went from the hospital straight to the walk-in hours of the community counseling center on base. At first, I was embarrassed and tried to hide it or downplay it. But then I realized, as a non-commissioned officer and as a leader, I had junior Marines that looked up to me and depended on me. As a leader, it was my duty to do the right thing and set a good example, even if that meant putting my pride aside. Prioritizing your mental health is nothing to be afraid of or embarrassed about. In fact, it's courageous and something to be very proud of. And you know what else I learned? Not only had I let stigmas and stereotypes define me, but I had internalized these things so much that I used the same stigmas and stereotypes I hated to define other women as those women. But here's the truth. There is no such thing as those women. We're all just other women trying to make our way in a man's world. While going through these realizations, I decided to keep taking college classes. But this time, I declared that I was taking these classes for me, not for male approval or validation. I was taking a class called History of the United States from Reconstruction to Present. My professor, Dr. Palagutan, was from the Philippines, but lived locally and would come on base to teach our class. At 19 years old, he was the first non-white teacher or professor I'd ever had. It was his class, coupled with my experiences after getting hurt, that turned my passion for social justice and positive change into a conscious motion. So there I was, sitting in class, wearing my camis, which is military slang for camo utility uniform, that read U.S. Marines on one side of my blouse and Hubay on the other. And I was really trying to discern my identity. I was learning about history, real history, for what felt like the first time. As Dr. Palagutan taught, I was engrossed in every syllable, glued to the slides, writing every word he spoke, until suddenly I stopped. And I raised my hand. Yeah, what? What did you just say? You said America did what? So I struggled with my identity for some time and grappled between my personal ethics and morals and the ones socially instilled in me. I joined because I wanted to help people and protect them and free them from oppression, yet in many ways we were the oppressor, both at home and abroad. By 2019, I had been honorably discharged from the United States Marine Corps, but was still living in California during the height of the border crisis. How was I supposed to sleep at night, given all that I'd learned, knowing such atrocious human rights violations were happening almost quite literally outside my back door? If I really wanted to help people, then this was an opportunity to prove that, and not to anyone else, but to myself. I began volunteering with the San Diego Rapid Response Network to vet potential volunteers and staff the housing shelters for asylum seekers who were released from ICE custody. I remember one cold night in December, I was working night shift at the shelter 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. It was my job to keep the doors locked, only letting approved volunteers in and out. Our shelter population was full of asylum seekers, so their safety was of our utmost concern. I got a call from a Rapid Response Network coordinator at around 3 a.m. telling me to set up more cots because we were getting 5 more people. A mother, an infant, and her 3 children who were 4, 6, and 8 years old. They had just been released from ICE detention about an hour ago and dropped off at one of the bus stations. I'll remind you, this was a cold night in December. ICE dropped off a mother, her 4 children, one of them an infant, in the middle of the night at a bus station, with no money, no ability to speak English, and no way to get to their sponsor. Had we not received a call about them, who knows how long they would have been out there, or what they would have done, or how they would have gotten to their sponsor all the way in New York from a random California bus station. I started getting more involved with other organizations and began crossing back and forth into Mexico, volunteering with an organization called Otro Lado, prepping immigrants with legal support for their credible fear interviews, all the while further igniting my passion for social justice. Eventually, I came to the conclusion that for me to do the best good, I needed a formal education to inform my action. I couldn't just rely on that one perspective-altering history class forever. After all, Nelson Mandela said that knowledge is the most powerful weapon for which you can use to change the world. So in fall 2019, I moved to Pittsburgh, PA, put down my physical weapon, and traded it in for my newest weapon, knowledge. I began attending Duquesne University, using my GI Bill, and tried out a few majors before settling into sociology and political science. Now I'm proudly part of the 4-to-1 Applied Public Sociology program, where I'm simultaneously a senior bachelor student and a first-year graduate student. As soon as I got to Duquesne, I started looking for ways to become involved on campus and in my community, all the while becoming more and more conscious and publicly minded. Before I knew it, I was taking on leadership roles, volunteering, going to protests and rallies all over the United States, organizing and facilitating events and programs, and slowly I began to really find myself and my purpose. In my first semester, I became Vice President of Students Against Sexual Violence, a title I still proudly carry today. In my second semester, I became Secretary of the Sociology Club, then Vice President, and now I'm in my second semester as President of the Sociology Club and of the Student Veteran Association. By January 2020, I had lost 10% of my platoon to suicide or overdose. With the help of my mentors, Dr. Sarah McMillan, I began conducting research to offer a systemic explanation of veteran suicide. I quickly found that the effects and impacts of spending time in an institution like that, like the military, go far beyond suicidality and can also be a driving force behind veteran homelessness, substance abuse, criminal activity, and more. Through my involvement with the Sociology Club and its faculty advisor, who is one of my closest mentors, Dr. Appel, I learned about the Elsinore-Bennu think tank for restorative justice and began regularly attending the Friday morning meetings. Before long, everyone was so much more than boxes on my Zoom screen. They were family. They also gave me key yet accidental insight into my research on veterans. Maybe these experiences of transition and reentry weren't unique to just veterans. Not only did I gain amazing new friends, family, and perspectives through the think tank, but the closer I became with everyone, the more I began to feel accepted and understood. I began to feel part of a community again. Today, I'm looking to the future with hope and optimism, knowing that my journey has only just begun. To that headstrong little girl from the kindergarten Halloween party, and that outspoken activist on the playground, I hope I've made you proud. Thanks for all the inspiration. Now here's to hoping I can inspire you to take action in big ways and small. Thank you.
morning, everyone. I'm excited to be with everyone today to continue the discussion on the hope and inspiration that can be found within social justice work. So many people can talk about the first moment they witnessed an event that changed their lives that made them want to become a part of the social movement. Others may remember conversations with family members, friends, or even community activists that made them also want to join the movement. For me, it was a little different. It started first with a call, but this wasn't just an ordinary call. So today, I want to discuss how I am answering that call. Now you may be asking, Rachel, who called you? What person did you get to speak to? Well, it wasn't just a person that I was speaking to. I got a special call from God. This call wasn't just me picking up my phone and hearing, Rachel, you're going to be someone who's going to work in the realm of social justice. It was much more bigger than that. Instead, it took a few steps to get there. Now, I want to talk about what I exactly mean when I say call. So when I say the word call, I'm talking about life's purpose. When I got a call from God, it's something not to be taken lightly, but it comes from developing a relationship with Him. And through that, He reveals a path for me to take to fulfill the purpose on my life. Now, this purpose wasn't revealed in an instant. Instead, it was revealed in a few steps along my life's journey. Now, it first started with my consistent interest in Black history as a little girl, and then it continued when I started seeing news stories about the unjust killings of unarmed Black men and women in our society. It was through these moments and many more that I heard someone speaking to me about the different ways I can lead to becoming a member of this call. Now, before I go any further, I want to dig deep into one specific scripture. It comes from the book of Micah, chapter 6, verse 8. And it says, Know, O people, the Lord has told you what is good, and this is what He requires of you, to do what is right, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. I want to reread that golden part one more time. This is what He requires of you, to do what is right. In some other versions, it says to act justly. Regardless of the version, whenever I read this, I hear God saying that it's important that whatever you do, you are doing the right thing. I look at our world and I see that there's so much going on. We see hate crimes being committed. We see so many unjust acts of police brutality and other forms of evil in the world. It makes me upset, angry, and frustrated whenever discrimination is shown in our world. And I can imagine you feel the same way too. But with all those emotions, I still have hope. This hope stems from my faith, but also the call that I've received. I can't look at everything and see what's going wrong and not want to do what is right. So this leads to exactly what my call is. I'm an individual committed to social justice through fighting for underrepresented communities, educating individuals on the importance of diversity, and calling out what is wrong. I see myself fulfilling this purpose in two specific areas. One, as a member of the Christian community, but also in my role as a student and part of the Duquesne community. So first, answering the call through faith. First, I want to say three names: Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, Tamir Rice. You may remember these names and are thinking of a few more that pop in your head. Each of them were killed in 2014 at the hands of police officers using deadly force, either by using guns or a chokehold. Their killings are some of the first that I can remember seeing in the news and wanting to create change in our world some way, somehow. So this led me to getting involved in a movement advocating for justice for these individuals. This led to my first experience with being involved in the racial justice movement. I participated in my first march in December of 2014. I was young yet excited to get involved in this movement. For me, it was more than just shouting out the words Black Lives Matter or saying I can't breathe. It was the start of me walking into my purpose while also carrying on my family's legacy. As you can see, these three pictures are from that 2014 march. This march took place one afternoon on a Sunday in Newark, New Jersey. 3 churches that are a part of the African Methodist Episcopal Church joined together to hold this march. And just as people saw in the civil rights movement, 3 pastors took charge and led their congregations through the streets of Newark to bring awareness that Black lives do matter. Along the way, we saw people honking their horns in support, and others shared their beliefs that justice needs to be reached in society. As I shared before, this was more than a march for me. It was a continuation of my family's legacy. The couple that you see in this corner here, these are my maternal grandparents. They're more than just my grandparents, but they have been activists and advocates for a long time. Both grew up in the segregated South and experienced the Jim Crow era. And although they grew up during a time where they were judged because of their skin color, they didn't let this stop them. Both of them got involved in the civil rights movement through joining the NAACP, attending marches, and even breaking barriers within the state of North Carolina. I also saw myself carrying on the family legacy in a different way in 2018 at the Act to End Racism rally. This rally was hosted by the National Council of Churches of Christ that brought members of various Christian denominations together in order to stand against racism in the United States. Many people spoke about racial unity that needs to exist in society, but it shouldn't just stop there. It should also come into the religious community. It was beautiful seeing so many people of all different races join together on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. It made me think about how about 50 years prior to this, Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech to a vast crowd on that National Mall. One of the people who he spoke in front of, was my grandfather. So my presence at the Act to End Racism rally once again symbolizes the continuation of a lineage of family members involved in bringing awareness to racial justice. While answering the call of their faith is important to me, I'm extremely passionate about answering it through the world of academia. As I mentioned before, part of my call is to educate people on the importance of diversity and calling out what is wrong. My place on Duquesne's campus allows me to do that in different ways. Prior to being a freshman at Duquesne, I knew I wanted to weave in racial justice and unity into my coursework some way, somehow. I didn't know how I would do it, but I was afforded that opportunity in my first English class. This course was focused on justice as a part of one of the learning communities, and it required each student to research a topic that they were interested in related to justice. By taking an approach through the work of the Christian church, I focused on racial healing and social action through the Christian church. I dug deep into 2 different areas. One, the Black social gospel, which is the engagement of the Black religious community engaging in social justice work, and then also how strides are being made within the Catholic Church to also address racial justice. My work has continued in the area of menstrual justice and attacking the issue of period poverty. For people who may not know what period poverty is, well, it refers to the inadequate access to menstrual hygiene tools and educations, including but not limited to sanitary products, washing facilities, and waste management, according to the American Women's Medical Association. To bring awareness to this issue on campus, I joined with the Sociology Club in order to host a panel discussion for my floor in a residence hall and others on campus. The panelists shed a light on the stigma behind this issue and also how it affects students. And the Sociology Club is also planning on starting a hygiene product drive to provide access to these products for students on campus. As you can see, bringing awareness to important issues can happen all around. It can also be done within the residence halls. In my role as a resident assistant, I knew it was important to use this position to educate residents on topics and facts they may not know a lot about. This led to the creation of the Did You Know That Black History Museum, hosted in February of this year from last semester. This program took a different approach to educating people on diversity by highlighting accomplishments in ways African Americans have broken barriers in different fields of study that aren't always talked about. One of the memories that I have from that event was a nursing student who came up to the table and learned about Dr. Charles Drew, who helped develop research that led to bettering the technique for blood transfusions and the storage of blood. After that, she said, I want to learn more about him, and then she decided to go learn more. It was in conversations with residents that I felt I fulfilled a small part of my overall purpose. Now, I have a question for each one of you. It may be a little tricky. What's calling you to fight for social justice? This question is a little heavy. It may be easy for some to answer, while a little bit more difficult for others. There may be some people here who may not even feel part of their life's purpose is to address social justice. And that's okay, because this work is not easy. It comes with high moments and it comes with low moments. But social justice is a huge topic that holds so many issues that need to be addressed. Now, you don't have to address them in huge ways, but you might be able to address them in your own studies, your own jobs, or in your community work. Social justice is more than just one thing. It's more complex than that. Every single one of us has the opportunity to be committed to the cause, but have different reasons why. So, your life's purpose or call may be motivated by your own experiences or witnessing someone being discriminated against. Nevertheless, finding your why is so important. And that's what is going to keep you whenever the struggle gets hard and the struggle gets real. Your why will keep you focused on all the injustices existing in the world. Try to blur your vision towards you fulfilling your actual purpose. It is your why that will keep you grounded. You can live out whatever call or purpose that motivates you. All you have to do is take it one step at a time. And remember, to always do what is right. Thank you.
Okay, I will do that. So, welcome everybody. I appreciate your time here, and I'm going to be talking about a little bit about applied sociology, particularly our program, and kind of give you guys an idea of what applied public sociology is. And kind of to help that, I'm going to present some research I did with a student some years ago, Aaron Fishke, who was in our then public policy graduate program, master's. We did a book chapter together, which covers a lot of the issues that I'm going to talk about today. And there's also an issue of social justice. It was about fracking in Pennsylvania and some of the impacts it had on various groups, but also kind of to build off of Dr. Schneirow's approach. It's one aspect of the social movement, which is the mobilization of many of the environmental groups in Western Pennsylvania. Okay, so give me just a second here, and make sure I'm sharing. Yeah.
Share. Move that one, right?
This one?
I got it.
Oh, these, of course. Is that showing up? Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Okay. All right. So the general question here is, we'll start off with what is applied public sociology at Duquesne? We have a master's program we just initiated here, and we think it has a unique approach. I think it informs issues of social justice as well as other things, and certainly gives people a course of study that allows them to pursue these kinds of issues. So that's great. We have, I think, a pretty straightforward master's program here. You'll take 9 credits in a concentration, either in community and social justice, health and gerontology, or criminal justice and society, of which we have, as many of you already know, a lot of professors that are working in these areas. Another part of this is we're doing a seminar in applied public sociology. D is part of that group this semester, and we're kind of exploring what that approach means, okay? And not just us, but to sociology in general and to the community in general. Along with that, and as you guys will see, particularly in applied sociology, but frankly across all types, the methodology of sociology is really very important. It courses qualitative, quantitative kinds of analyses, and much of the research you end up doing on social justice or other topics would utilize those. I'll show you some examples of that today. And then a course in theory, applied social theory, as well as 6 credits and other elective methods. And then the capstone experience here is work that she would do that comes out of your own interests. And those may be individual, as in a thesis, or we also have work that we're doing in research groups and that community research practicum that we have, depending on what we have going on with our community partners, gives you an opportunity to bring all of this together. Now, I think that's a pretty straightforward program, but maybe what isn't as clear is what the heck do we mean by applied public sociology? It sounds very good. And actually in the seminar this semester, we're spending some time saying, well, what does that mean to the general field of academic sociology? What makes it similar? What makes it different? Well, what I'm going to do is give you guys a couple of approaches to think about these and to understand what each of these dimensions might mean to you if you were to take this course and study. In a simple manner, one of the main types of sociology, and one we certainly present here at Duquesne, is sort of the traditional academic sociology. For most students, this is a preparation for, in the end, for scholarly positions. Universities, the orientation is teaching and research. And this is much as sociology has been for a long time. The concern is always, well, you know, if I go into this area, do I have to go on and end up as being a professor? Many people want that or something related to it. But the paths there were somewhat limited, and certainly the approach was very much defined in terms of traditional sociological theory. Okay. Applied sociology is much more practically oriented. Here, what is developed are applications to sociology in the private sector, in government, and there are many positions in terms of this, and in the not-for-profit sector. And I guess I would also add that within that, advocacy groups oftentimes make use of the skills and approaches and ideas that we develop in terms of this. Finally, public sociology, which sounds very good, but you might not immediately think about what does that mean. Well, it's basically an approach that utilizes community engaged research. It's research that is in the public interest. It is something that is usually done in the community rather than in the universities, although it oftentimes originates in universities. And I guess I would say too that although there's sort of this emerging movement of public sociology and community engagement, sociology actually has a long tradition in terms of doing this that has languished a bit, I think, in recent years. And so it is both new and a rediscovery of people like Jane Addams and Hull House, and others that were doing research in service of society and in service of different groups. All right. Kind of dig into that just a little bit more deeply. We kind of think of this in terms of what kind of knowledge or applications or focus are being pursued in each of these areas. Certainly in academic sociology, theoretical knowledge for the sociological discipline is probably the touchstone focus. We are trying to, traditional approach, build knowledge, abstract knowledge that accumulates and tells more about society. It oftentimes uses a whole set of well understood theories, and you might end up specializing some of these things. Applied sociology. This ends up being more focused on practical knowledge. Methodology becomes really important in this approach. And meeting with groups who might end up hiring you or to whom you might be consulting becomes an important way of pursuing this approach. It is, we sometimes refer to the approach here as being embedded in various organizations. You may not be asked, or it may not be advertising for a sociologist per se, but they sure want somebody that can work with data, that can do the qualitative research, that can bring to bear the ideas and methods of sociology to practical applications that are needed by these organizations. Finally, public sociology, which tends to reside in universities, although not exclusively, but is more oriented towards the non-academic world and is specifically trying to develop impactful knowledge that advances the conditions of people in general, and is focused on not just the big questions in sociology, but the important questions in the community, finding ways to address those kinds of questions. What are the methods and perspectives in terms of this? Well, academic sociology tends to have methods that are instrumental. You bring theories and you bring methods to bear to answer big questions that sociologists are most interested in. And if you probably have seen this with your professors, but you have a certain latitude to pursue the methods and the ideas and the theories that you want. Oftentimes, whatever happens to interest sociologists is what they work on for a couple of years. That's a little bit different from the applied world, where inquiry is direct. You are working, in a sense, for those organizations and meeting needs in those organizations. And so your latitude to explore things is more limited. Actually, we just last night had a presentation by one of our students who was working in the police department doing data analysis, Irwin. She was talking about this. Dee asked the question, well, you get to do the things that you want to do. And she gave a very nice answer, I thought, which was basically no, except sometimes. And that makes sense. I mean, she's working for the city of Pittsburgh, and she's working for this part of the governmental organization, and is doing the things that needed, by the police force, by the government, those sorts of things. Although sometimes they have the latitude to explore topics that are of interest to her department, but maybe that she's general. That's very typical of applied work. Another aspect of this is in terms of consulting. I've done some work in this, and you're literally hired for as a short-term researcher to do a very specific job. You don't have the latitude to choose what question you're going to ask. You're working for somebody that needs certain questions asked. And in both cases, inquiry is directed by the organization. Public sociology is more like general academic sociology in that you would have latitude to explore topics that you're interested in, but it is more constrained because the key idea of public sociology is that you do this in cooperation reflexively with university or outside university partners. They are helping you understand what questions need to be answered, and you work with them in this kind of back and forth approach to develop ideas and approaches and questions that are most needed. Although you have a certain amount of latitude in terms of this to say, well, here is, let's work on this. Let's try to work out a partnership about how best to answer these things. So, now, I also want to be clear here that these three approaches overlap. Yes, Boolean operators. Okay. It isn't as if you become one an applied sociologist or become a public sociologist or become an academic sociologist. We oftentimes move between these different focuses at different points in our career. And so as a sociologist, this is something that gives you some flexibility in what you do and how you operate. Okay, so I hope that helped clarify some of this. So in our approach, what I want to show you now is a research project we did a few years back that I think shows how these three different areas operate. Because in this, Aaron and I ended up moving pretty much back and forth between the academic world, the applied world, and what's now become public sociology. We did a research project with your thesis work, sociospatial polls and the advocacy of development. How am I doing on time?
You're doing okay. Another 5 minutes.
Okay. I'll move this pretty quickly. This is part of a much larger project, both for what Aaron did in the thesis, and then what we did together to publish results I brought together in my work. We ended up doing a chapter in a book called Recapturing Space, New Middle Range Theory of Spatial Demography. So I don't know if it is as much in the public eye as it once was, but fracking in Western Pennsylvania raised all sorts of problems. Let's see if I can move this a little bit out here. As you might see in the graph here, hydrofracturing, which is a way of getting gas out of the ground, particularly old wells and old shale deposits, is kind of exploded from about 2010 on, right? It's a new technology. It came in, as you can kind of see in this little diagram on the left. What it does is that dig down about half a mile or so into the shale fields, blast the shale to put it into smithereens, and the gas comes up then. Small pockets of gas that normally wouldn't be viable can all come up at once, so they end up coming back to the surface and being carried off. Well, it carries all sorts of risks associated with it. Things from people's groundwater becoming polluted, rather famously in Dimmock, Pennsylvania, people found they had to light their faucets on fire because of gas, and there were explosions. There was loss of farmland. Farmers ended up having to abandon their way of life, and given the kind of peculiar laws of Pennsylvania, one doesn't own the mineral rights under their own property, so they can actually drill under your property from adjacent lots, even if you don't get permission and you get the call out of that. Well, as this all began to explode, certainly there are lots and lots and lots of areas throughout Western Pennsylvania that were very concerned about this. It differentially impacted rural communities, because that's the drilling companies first started. And but it was pretty widespread. It was kind of went from the western part of the state on through the northeastern, and it created a whole bunch of division within the communities throughout western Pennsylvania. Those that were concerned about it, those that were looking to benefit from it financially, and in many towns throughout the state that were in the shale point, the shale districts here, were desperate to try to figure out how to deal with all this. Well, one of the ways that they dealt with this was to turn to certain types of organizations to get better information. Many of those organizations were environmental organizations, like the Penn Environment, but many others. And they began to develop networks for exchange as well as for advocacy to counter the big gas companies as they came in. And that actually fit with the book that came out about that time by Doug Gaddings, social movements theorist. And what was his book about
Freedom Summer.
Freedom Summer? Yeah, kind of one of the foundation books of social movements. But he and Hillary Baudet came out with a book called Putting Social Movements into Place, play on words, explaining opposition to energy projects in the United States, in which he developed more of a community-based approach to the development of social networks, or of these movements, and a social networks approach, which was already in the literature. So we use that, and that's part of the academic to study this. So, and this was Irwin's work. We kind of came up with the design. Aaron was really interested in doing qualitative assessments of this, but plus she had worked many years with the environment. So she had the connections to this. And we came up with a design that targeted three types of organizations: sportsmen's groups, environmental organizations, conservation districts, and state parks, which turned out to be a major player in terms of all of this. And developed kind of a mixed methods approach in which we were using both qualitative interviews. She went out early on and interviewed many of these organizations to get kind of feedback inductively. And then later turned that into surveys where we could better quantify some of the things that we found out about this. And finally, to actually measure the networks that were forming out there. And kind of anecdotally, we were hearing that environmental groups, which have been notoriously fragmented up to this point in time, were suddenly coalescing in the face of what they conceived of as overwhelming threats to the environment. And those networks came about as a way of better resourcing the environmental movements that arose to try to oppose fracking. All right. So the study that we did was we couldn't spend time going all over the state, but two big intensive areas. Here we're in the Northeast and the Southwest. That's where all the fracking was taking, all but most fracking was taking place. And Aaron went out and surveyed eventually what became 187 environmental organizations. 58 she was able to do in-depth surveys, and it covered much of the impact of counties in the state. All right. Now I'm just going to quickly show you some of this to give you guys an idea of what kinds of things we looked at. The main question was what was the content of those network connections as these organizations began to connect with one another. What kind of things were you doing? What kind of things were exchanging? Information? Was it resources? Was it money? Was it personnel? And the big things were information, which is oftentimes a critical part of networks, and basically public awareness of what was going on. Then we also wanted to know what were the barriers to those connections. For most, internally, it was just not enough resources, not enough time, money, or people. Almost half the organizations had that as a major reason they couldn't do more for connection. About a third of the other organizations were already covering the Marcellus Shale, so they just opted out. I suspect that was probably just an outcome of poor resources. They had to decide what they were going to look at, and then there were a smattering of other things that went on. But from that, we were able to actually construct the networks among these organizations. This is the connections both within these two regions and across those two regions. So the size of the circles there sort of capture how central each of these areas were in terms of this network that among these kinds of organizations. This is another way of looking at it, which is kind of like if you had psychology, some of the sociometric diagrams you might see among individuals, but it is actually placing the different counties and how central they are or how dispersed they are. What we're really interested in, and as a practical matter, is who's left out. That in this kind of accidental network formation, some places were included, some were not. In the Northeast, Susquehanna, Sullivan, Potter counties, way northern tier kinds of northeastern counties, we're pretty much out of those networks. And unfortunately, they were also some of the ones that were most impacted by fracking. In the Southwest, Washington, Beaver, Greene, and Fayette were all counties that had very little connection to the networks. And so from that, we are actually able to come up with some conclusions. Just the analysis of those networks were something that was of interest to academics in terms of big questions to sociology. What we found was basically the distance and the numbers of environmental organizations and communities explained a lot of where those networks form. Too far away, they don't form. Have a core of environmental groups, and they do form. It didn't have anything to do with the amount of hydrofracturing going on, which is this disjunction between networks. We also had a number of what we think of as public sociology outcomes, impactful knowledge for non-academic world. We found that there were characteristics of those two networks in the two regions that where there were holes in that network. Of the two, the Northeast was better connected, even though they had fewer organizations. And the Southwest, down there in Reed County and others, were was left off. And I suppose it was just a traditional sociological analysis that's where we stop, but this is what brings it into also the applied. We know that those organizations wanted to get specific information about how to do this better, where to reach out, where to put the resources. So we showed them that, we gave them reports as we finished this up, and came up with interaction with them to come up with possible ways of addressing the problems. The big one was creating summits among different environmental organizations to enhance network connections. Duquesne ended up doing one of those here. Secondly, coming up with public responses based on the kinds of information you might generate. Okay. Finally, unfortunately, this never got off the ground, but we have made arrangements with the Coast Gazette to create a interactive GIS map that would help connect these organizations as well. They were willing, but 2 reporters are working on it. Got hired away 5 and that's good job. So we have stuff. Okay. So if there is more information either about this is the kind of work we do at the master's level, or if you would like more information about the program, or just more generally want to contact somebody, here is the information. Just one quick last comment here, which is Erin ended up going for a PhD in Michigan Tech in environmental studies, and she is now a legislative analyst in Oregon, working on these kinds of issues. This is the kind of jobs that you get using developing this kind of approach. It may be a little bit harder if you were just doing a traditional sociology.
Oh. Yes.
So, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ethan Moore. I am the current president of the Student Wellbeing Club and the current ambassador on the student side for the Center of Student Wellbeing, mainly the Counseling Center. I apologize for being a bit late today. Seems that sciences just couldn't have enough of me. But I am grateful to have the opportunity to speak today. Because I know I'm not the traditional type of person. I'm actually a student of the psychology department. But nevertheless, I too have an impact on social justice. And I take a lot of pride in it. Because it's something that's up and running, and that's mental health, something that we're breaking a stigma from, something that we are trying to get out in the public's eye, out on the forefront of legislation. And my job, while it's not directly lobbying, it is giving the students and even the faculty a voice here on campus in any way possible. Specifically in my organization, I work with students to educate. We talk about what is anxiety, what is depression, what is seasonal affective disorder, which is a subset of depression that's more seasonally based. And interestingly enough, I just found out the other week, there are 2 types. There is a type that is prevalent in the spring and summer, but that I don't believe has as much frequency, given that the general idea is that it affects people in the fall and winter with the lack of sun. But besides that, and I generally apologize to my students and peers for this, we have the unfortunate task of tackling suicide prevention, something that strikes this nation, strikes us even in our communities so hard. That strikes me hard. I actually, during my freshman year, lost a fellow student of mine from high school to suicide. And if that wasn't bad enough, I lost my own father last year. But with him, it came to be drug addiction as a contributing factor. alcohol. Both of those being used under the substance use disorder, no longer considered the substance abuse or addiction disorder. It's classified by the DSM-5. And it made it hard on our family to the behavior of that, which, ironically enough, I didn't think was trauma. I didn't think was abuse, because we think of abuse as being physical, as being something that leaves a mark, just like injury, just like illness. But in my work, of course, I'm bringing to awareness that injury and illness are not just physical, they are psychological. And that's what we talk about a lot in my group. But I digress from the important part here, suicide prevention. My group, along with Active Minds and hopefully the Student Health Advisory Committee, are working together with the counseling department to communicate with the American Federation or Foundation for Suicide Prevention to host our annual Out of the Darkness Walk, which is typically an annual, outside of COVID, walk that sponsors an event for suicide survivors to come together, and for even those that weren't directly affected. Because let's face it, we're starting to be well equipped with knowledge that it's not just the person that commits. They suffer putting our ideas with them physically on, and sometimes suffering a second death when they leave our memories. It affects us as survivors. It affects us as community members, legislative members in the local, state, and national government. And it's time that we bring awareness about this type of suffering that our people go through. I've mentioned already a few of my hopes and inspirations for my work. My hopes are to bring around awareness of what is going on. Again, it's not necessarily a physical thing. I mean, anxiety becomes better seen when, the kid or adult next to you is bouncing on life uncontrollably, or they're having fits, or they feel so anxious in a science class, as I once did, that they had to run out of the room to use the bathroom unsafely. My dad was a big contributor to me wanting to help other people. I look back on it as now an adult, and it's difficult because I thought highly of my father as a child, and then that died along the way. But now I wish that I could have reconnected. I feel nowadays that with my education in psych that I may have been able to. I just attended my psych disorders lecture this week, and we were talking about AA, and I think I started to begin to understand what he was after, what he was trying to find, because he did go to AA, but as a child I did not know what that was. And that's what I hope to bring out of education, to understand what the other person goes through. We may not understand it on a level that they do, but still, any education, any understanding can help us to help them. My personal struggles, as many of my peers now, is a very driving factor, because as I've stated, I suffer from anxiety and depression, seasonal affective disorder. I've been through emotional abuse. I've been through my father's alcohol abuse and drug abuse. and him kind of losing our family, his death. But it's been kind of challenging, I'll say. I had my neighbor this week talk to me, and she asked me, if you're so troubled, why do you leave? And kind of stuck with me. I'm not an emotionless person, emotionless object, so like I obviously had a reaction to it. But it got me thinking, and I got back to her about a day or two later, and I was like, would you rather somebody who's never gone through it? I may suffer, and yes, I fully admit I don't always rise up to the challenge. I do neglect my emails. I have had some troubles getting the Out of Darkness walk up and running, but I'm getting there. I'm going through my own struggles, but with me going through that, I understand how I can help other people. I understand what they're going through, when at least a human. It's taken a lot. I'm trying to be as honest as possible up here without breaking professional kosher. It's messy. It's not a neat little box. We have diagnostic manuals, but that doesn't mean that we can follow them like the doctors do. Which, that's not to say that psychologists and psychiatrists are doctors, just in a different sense. But we're making that transition. I find it very rewarding. Even if I'm helping somebody, I don't know how many times I've called the suicide hotline for somebody, even my own sister. But you know that you're making a difference. You're connecting them with resources, which is another thing I like to do. I make those resources known as much as I can. And I know this is a lot, but why not educate? This is why we're here. This is why I'm here. I didn't come to Pittsburgh just to kind of bump around the streets. I came here to educate myself. I came here to be surrounded by people who care. I have troubles back with some of the ideology, but that's to be expected. But I find out here that Allegheny County and the Pittsburgh area are willing to make a change. They're further than my county. My behavioral health network out there has people waiting 9 months just for an intake. While out here, you guys have crisis. That's amazing. That's amazing that you guys are able to do that. Because that should be something done in every year. But then again, you guys are kind of leading the state in a lot of the development. But if I gotta give any advice today, keep on learning. Reach out to each other. I know I ask people how are they doing, and sometimes they say okay. And I thought about that response earlier this week, and I'm like, no, it's 2 letters. I don't think that's really summing up how you feel. Or we say, I'm good. Oh man. I mean, I think it would be better if you said like, well, I'm not doing all that great. Or I'm doing all right. All right kind of starts to lead us through that door. Kind of starts to bring a little bit of truth in there because we're all struggling. And just because we're shy about it, about what we're going through, doesn't mean we got to do it alone. I'm trying not to. I'm reaching out, but I can't have that same expectation right away. So that's why we just work one day at a time, one step at a time. If anybody would like to join the Student Wellbeing Club, we do meet bi-weeklies on Monday at 9 p.m. in College 220. That's open to undergraduate and graduate students, faculty. I'll say alumni, though I don't traditionally see too many alumni outside of Union or Gumberg, but we'd love to have you. We're a small group, and that has been a little distraught. I'd like to have more people, but I going to accept, a few people as successful. Any progress we make is progress. That's what you're going to take away. Thank you.
Well, we can entertain questions from folks here as well as connecting through Zoom.